When the 7-year-old girl, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, slid a crayon drawing across the sticky diner tabletop, the man mountain known as Grizz did not see a child's idle doodle. He saw a desperate message, a silent scream captured in wax and paper. His expulsion from the diner moments later by a manager who judged him by the leather on his back, rather than the heart in his chest, did not end the encounter. It was merely the beginning. That simple, panicked act of a frightened child set off a chain of events that would shatter the rainy afternoon calm, unmask a monster hiding in plain sight, and force a prideful man to beg for forgiveness from the very person he had so wrongly condemned. The Corner Booth Diner was a relic of a bygone era, a place where coffee was always hot, and the scent of fried bacon clung to the air like a permanent resident. Rain lashed against the large plate glass windows, turning the world outside into a blurry watercolor of gray and asphalt. Inside, the low hum of conversation and the clatter of cutlery provided a comforting soundtrack to an otherwise dreary Tuesday. It was the kind of place people came to escape the weather, to find a moment of warmth and predictability in a world that offered little of either. Frank Miller, known to his brothers in the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club as Grizz, occupied a small booth by the window. At 47, he was a formidable presence. A thick, gray-streaked beard cascaded down his chest, partially obscuring the intricate eagle patch on his leather vest. His hands, resting on the chipped formica table, were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had spent 20 years as an army ranger before trading his fatigues for denim and leather. He was large, quiet, and moved with a deliberate economy that spoke of immense, controlled power. To the other patrons, he was an intimidating figure, an outlier in their world of soft sweaters and softer lives. To Grizz, this was just a stop for coffee on a long ride home. He nursed his mug, watching the rain, his mind a quiet space of reflection. He was thinking about the long road, the hum of his Harley-Davidson, a familiar meditation. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, for the last decade of his life, he had actively avoided it. The world had enough chaos. He had seen more than his share in deserts and mountains far from this sleepy town. Now, he sought peace. He sought the simple comfort of a hot drink on a cold day. Then they came in. A man and a little girl. The man, probably in his late 30s, was of average height and build, dressed in a polo shirt and slacks that were slightly damp from the rain. He looked unremarkable, the kind of man who would disappear into any crowd. He held the girl's hand in a grip that seemed just a little too tight, a little too possessive. The girl was small for her age, a fragile thing with dark, tangled hair and a pale, serious face. Her coat was thin, inadequate for the biting November chill, and her sneakers were worn, the soles separating near the toes. But it was her eyes that snared Grizz's attention. They were wide and watchful, constantly scanning the room, the door, the face of the man who held her hand. They were the eyes of a soldier on patrol in enemy territory, alert to every sound, every movement, every potential threat. Grizz knew those eyes. He had seen them on children in war-torn villages and on young recruits facing their first firefight. They were eyes that had seen too much and expected the worst. The manager, a man named Thompson with a fussy mustache and a perpetually worried expression, greeted them with a strained smile. He seated them in the booth directly across the aisle from Grizz. The man, who the girl called Dad, ordered for both of them without consulting her. A burger for him, a plain grilled cheese for her. The girl said nothing, her gaze fixed on the salt shaker on the table. She folded her small hands in her lap, a model of perfect, silent obedience. Grizz felt it then, a low thrum of unease, a cold whisper from the part of his brain that was trained to recognize things that were not right. It was the same instinct that had told him not to walk down a certain alley in Baghdad, the same gut feeling that had made him check the undercarriage of his Humvee in extra time before a convoy. It was a silent alarm, honed by years of living on the knife's edge between life and death. Others saw a father and daughter out for lunch. Grizz saw a predator and his prey. He saw the way the man's smile never reached his eyes when he spoke to the waitress. He saw the way the girl flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement when her father's hand brushed her shoulder as he reached for a napkin. He saw the lack of color in her cheeks, the faint, bluish shadow beneath her left eye, expertly concealed with what looked like makeup but not quite hidden from a trained observer. He saw the way she ate her sandwich, taking small, precise bites as if she were afraid of making a mess, of drawing any attention to herself at all. The manager, Mr. Thompson, noticed Grizz watching them, his brow furrowed in disapproval. He saw a big, scary biker staring at a little girl, and his mind leaped to the most obvious and most wrong conclusion. He straightened his tie and began to walk toward Grizz's booth, his expression a mixture of self-importance and manufactured courage. He was a man protecting his establishment, his patrons, from a perceived threat. Grizz knew the look. He had been getting it his whole life, especially since he had traded in his uniform for his club colors. People saw the leather, the beard, the sheer size of him, and they filled in the blanks with their own fears. They saw a monster, a criminal, a danger. They rarely saw the man underneath, the man who had pulled friends from burning vehicles and held the hands of dying comrades. They did not see the man who volunteered at the local animal shelter, because dogs didn't judge you by the vest you wore. As Mr. Thompson approached, the little girl, Lily, did something unexpected. She had been given a paper placemat and a small cup of crayons by the waitress. For the last 10 minutes, she had been drawing with intense concentration. Now she looked up, her gaze locking with Grizz's for a fleeting second. Her eyes were not just scared, they were pleading. It was a look that transcended language, a direct appeal from one soul to another. Her father was distracted looking at his phone. In that brief window, Lily pushed her drawing across the table. It slid off the edge and fluttered to the floor, landing face up in the aisle, halfway between her booth and Grizz's. It was a simple, childish drawing. A big, dark, jagged shape loomed over a tiny stick figure lying on the ground. The big shape had angry red scribbles for eyes. The small figure had blue, tear-like streaks running from its face. It was a portrait of terror. Grizz's blood went cold. This was it. This was the signal. Not a cry for help, but a drawing. A confirmation, delivered in crayon, that his instincts were screaming the unvarnished truth. The monster was not the man in the leather vest. The monster was the man in the polo shirt, the man who was supposed to be her protector. Before Grizz could even think to move, to pick up the drawing, Mr. Thompson was there, blocking his view. "Sir," the manager said, his voice tight and officious, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Grizz looked up at the smaller man, his expression unreadable. "I'm just finishing my coffee." "You're making my customers uncomfortable," Thompson insisted, gesturing vaguely toward the family. "Your presence is disruptive." Grizz glanced over at the booth. The father, Mark, looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He saw the manager confronting the biker, and a smirk touched his lips. He enjoyed the sight of someone else being singled out, of authority being exerted. Lily, however, had shrunk back into the vinyl seat, her face pale, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She was watching the drawing on the floor, her small hands clenched into fists. She had sent her message, and now she was terrified of the consequences. The decision came to Grizz in a fraction of a second. He could argue. He could make a scene, explain his suspicions, point to the drawing on the floor. But he knew how that would look. A giant, rough-looking biker accusing a normal father, based on a gut feeling and a child's drawing. The manager would double down. The father would play the victim. The police would be called, and he would be the one painted as the aggressor. The little girl would be forced to deny everything, trapped by her fear of the man beside her. He would lose, and more importantly, she would lose. So he chose a different path. He looked at Mr. Thompson, his gaze steady. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and laid it on the table. It was more than enough for the coffee. He stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to suck the air out of the immediate vicinity. He had to walk past the drawing. He had to leave it there on the floor, a silent testament to the girl's terror. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done. As he passed their booth, he made eye contact with Lily one last time. He gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a promise. "I see you. I'm not leaving you." Her eyes widened just a fraction, a flicker of something that might have been hope. Her father grabbed the drawing from the floor, crumpled it into a ball without looking at it, and shoved it into his pocket, his knuckles white. Grizz pushed through the diner door and stepped out into the cold, driving rain. The chill hit him, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, adrenaline singing through his veins. He had been dismissed, but he had not been defeated. This was not over. He walked to his motorcycle, a massive black Harley-Davidson Road Glide that looked as powerful and indomitable as he did. He swung a leg over the seat, the wet leather cold against his jeans. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, in the pouring rain, watching the front door of the corner booth diner. He was a sentinel now, a guardian in waiting. He pulled his collar up against the wind, the water dripping from his beard, and he watched. Inside, Mr. Thompson felt a wave of smug satisfaction. He had handled the situation. He had protected his customers and his business. He preened a little, puffing out his chest as he walked back to the counter. He had faced down the big, scary biker and won. He glanced out the window and his satisfaction curdled into annoyance. The biker was still there, just sitting on his machine, a brooding statue in the rain. What was he doing? Trying to intimidate him? 10 minutes later, the father and daughter emerged from the diner. The father, Mark, was dragging Lily by the arm, his fingers digging into her thin bicep. Her feet stumbled on the wet pavement. "I told you to finish your sandwich," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. But Grizz could read the fury on his lips even from a distance. "You know what happens when you waste my money." Lily was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. She did not make a sound, a skill she had clearly been forced to master. This was the moment. The gut feeling, the drawing, the fear in her eyes. It all coalesced into this one ugly public display of cruelty. This was the proof. This was the call to action. Grizz's decision had already been made. Now it was time to execute. He fired up the Harley. The engine roared to life with a thunderous clap that split the rainy afternoon, a sound of pure, unadulterated American power. It was a sound that demanded attention. Mark jumped, startled, his head snapping toward the source of the noise. He saw Grizz astride his iron horse, his face set like granite. Fear, real and potent, flashed across Mark's face, quickly replaced by indignant rage. "What do you want?" he yelled over the engine's roar. "You following us?" Grizz didn't answer. He simply put the bike in gear and rolled it forward, slowly, deliberately, positioning the massive machine directly behind Mark's nondescript sedan, blocking him in. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was more menacing than the noise. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. He shoved Lily behind him, a grotesque parody of a protective father. "Get that thing out of my way! I'll call the cops!" "Go ahead," Grizz said, his voice calm and even. He swung his leg off the bike and stood to his full height. He took a step forward. "I think you should." Just then, the diner door flew open. Mr. Thompson came striding out, his face red with fury. "I knew it. I knew you were trouble. I told you to leave. Get out of my parking lot right now, or I'm calling the police." "He's already planning to," Grizz said, his eyes never leaving Mark. "Aren't you?" Mark's composure was crumbling. He was trapped between a man he instinctively knew was dangerous and a witness who saw him as the victim. He chose the path of the martyr. "This maniac is harassing me and my daughter," he screamed at Thompson. "He was staring at her in the diner, and now he's followed us out here. Help me." Thompson's face hardened with righteous conviction. He had been right all along. The biker was a predator. He pulled out his own phone. "That's it. I'm calling them right now. You're going to jail, you freak." As Thompson fumbled with his phone, Grizz took another slow step forward. He wasn't looking at the manager. His entire focus was on the little girl cowering behind her father's legs. "Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It's okay. You're going to be okay." The use of her name seemed to break a spell. Mark's eyes widened in panic. How did he know her name? He had become so fixated on his performance for the manager that he had not realized Grizz was close enough to have heard him speak to her. "Stay away from my daughter," Mark shrieked, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. He started to drag Lily toward the passenger side of the car, trying to get her inside, to get away. Grizz moved. He was not fast, but he was inexorable. He covered the distance in 2 long strides and placed a heavy hand on Mark's shoulder. It was not a violent act, but it was an absolute one. Mark stopped as if he had run into a brick wall. The strength he felt through his thin polo shirt was terrifying. "Let go of the child," Grizz said, each word a block of ice. The confrontation hung in the air, a tableau of simmering violence in the pouring rain. The enraged father, the terrified child, the self-righteous manager on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, and the immovable biker. The wail of a siren in the distance signaled the end of the standoff and the beginning of the reckoning. 2 police cruisers screeched into the parking lot, lights flashing, scattering puddles. 4 officers emerged, their hands on their sidearms, their faces grim and professional. They took in the scene, the blocked car, the crying child, the furious manager, the panicked father, and the giant biker with his hand on the father's shoulder. "Everybody freeze! Show me your hands," one of the officers commanded. Grizz immediately raised his hands, taking a slow step back from Mark. He turned to face the officers, his expression calm. He knew this part of the dance. He knew how it looked. But he also knew the truth was on his side. "He assaulted me. He blocked my car and he assaulted me," Mark yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Grizz. "He's been stalking my little girl." Mr. Thompson rushed forward. "It's true, officer. I kicked him out of my diner for harassing them, and he waited out here to ambush them. I saw the whole thing." 2 of the officers moved toward Grizz, their expressions wary. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back," the lead officer said. As they began to cuff him, an older officer, a sergeant with weary eyes and a graying mustache, stepped forward. He looked at Grizz, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Miller? Frank Miller? Is that you?" Grizz met the sergeant's gaze. "Hello, Dave. Long time no see." Sergeant Dave Roberts had known Frank Grizz Miller back when he was a decorated ranger who occasionally helped local law enforcement with tactical training. He knew Miller was not a man prone to hysterics or random acts of violence. He was quiet, disciplined, and had some of the best instincts Dave had ever seen. "What's going on here, Frank?" Sergeant Roberts asked, his tone shifting from confrontational to inquisitive. "This man is hurting his daughter," Grizz said simply, nodding toward Mark. "I tried to stop him." "He's lying," Mark screamed. "He's a monster. Look at him." Sergeant Roberts ignored him. He looked at Mr. Thompson. "You saw him assault this man?" "Well, he put his hand on him. He blocked his car. He was menacing," Thompson stammered, his certainty beginning to waver under the sergeant's steady gaze. A female officer, Officer Chen, had knelt beside Lily. She spoke in a soft, soothing voice, creating a small bubble of calm amidst the chaos. "Hey there," she said gently. "My name is Maria. Can you tell me your name?" Lily looked from the kind officer to her father, her eyes wide with terror. Mark shot her a look of pure venom, a silent threat that screamed louder than any shout. She clamped her mouth shut. "It's all right," Officer Chen said softly. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Grizz watched, his heart aching for the child. "Check his pocket, Dave," he said to the sergeant. "Her drawing." Sergeant Roberts looked at Grizz, then at Mark. "Sir, I'm going to need you to empty your pockets." "You have no right," Mark sputtered. "I have a credible witness suggesting a child is in danger. Empty your pockets or I'll get a warrant and we can do this downtown. Your choice." Defeated, Mark angrily pulled out his keys, his wallet, and a small, crumpled ball of paper. He threw them on the hood of his car. Sergeant Roberts carefully picked up the paper ball and uncreased it. He stared at the child's drawing of the giant, menacing figure and the small, crying victim. His face hardened. He walked over to Officer Chen. "Maria, can you take the little girl and sit with her in your cruiser for a minute? Maybe see if she's cold?" It was a pretext, and they all knew it. Officer Chen gently guided the trembling Lily toward her car. Once inside, with the door closed, she turned on the heat. "That's a very interesting drawing," she said softly, showing it to Lily. "Can you tell me about it?" Away from her father's terrifying gaze, cocooned in the safety of the police car, the dam finally broke. Lily's story came tumbling out in a torrent of whispered, fragmented sentences. She spoke of being hungry, of being left alone, of being locked in her room. She spoke of her father's mean hands and the scary yelling. And then, with a trembling finger, she pointed to the faint bruise under her eye. "Daddy did this," she whispered. "He said I had to put Mommy's makeup on it so no one would see." Officer Chen's expression became a mask of cold fury. She radioed Sergeant Roberts. Her voice was clipped and professional, but the rage underneath was palpable. The sergeant listened, nodded, and then turned to Mark. The time for questions was over. "Mark Jennings," he said, his voice flat and hard. "You are under arrest for child endangerment and assault." He snapped the cuffs on Mark's wrists with a final, decisive click. Mark Jennings collapsed, all the bluster and rage gone, replaced by sniveling protests. "It's a misunderstanding. She's a clumsy kid. She lies." No one was listening. Mr. Thompson stood frozen on the wet pavement, his mouth hanging open. The world had just turned upside down. The hero and the villain had switched places right before his eyes. The monster he had judged and condemned was the man who had saved a child. The respectable father he had sought to protect was the real monster. A wave of shame so profound it made him physically ill washed over him. He looked at Grizz, who was now having his own cuffs removed, and saw not a threat, but a savior. The immediate aftermath was a blur of official procedure and raw emotion. Mark Jennings was placed in the back of a cruiser and driven away, his pathetic protests fading into the rain. Child Protective Services was called. Officer Chen stayed with Lily in her warm car, talking to her about cartoons and puppies, slowly coaxing the light back into her terrified eyes. Sergeant Roberts walked over to Grizz, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good instincts, Frank. You haven't lost your touch." He handed Grizz a card. "We'll need a formal statement, but for now, thank you. You did the right thing." Grizz simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked over at the cruiser, at the small silhouette of the girl inside. He had seen her. That was all that mattered. It was then that Mr. Thompson approached, his face pale, his fussy mustache drooping. He stopped in front of the big biker, looking utterly defeated. I don't know what to say," he began, his voice trembling. "I was so wrong. I was so stupidly, horribly wrong. I saw your vest and I made up my mind about you. I almost let him get away with her." Tears welled in the manager's eyes. "Can you forgive me?" Grizz looked at the man, at his genuine remorse and shame. He saw not an enemy, but just another person who had let fear cloud his judgment. "You made a mistake," Grizz said, his voice softer than Thompson could have imagined. "We all do. What matters is what you do next." A short while later, another car pulled into the lot, a beat-up station wagon that screeched to a halt. A frantic woman jumped out. "Lily!" she cried, her voice raw with panic. It was Lily's mother. The police had found her number in the system. It turned out she had been fighting a desperate custody battle against her abusive ex-husband, who had taken the child that morning in violation of a court order. Officer Chen opened the cruiser door. "Mommy!" Lily's small voice was a bird taking flight. She scrambled out of the car and launched herself into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, a small island of love and relief in the cold, wet parking lot. The reunion was fierce and desperate, a mending of a bond that had been violently torn. After a few moments, Lily looked up from her mother's embrace. Her eyes found Grizz. She slowly let go of her mom and walked toward him, her small hand outstretched. In it was a single, slightly damp crayon, a bright, sunny yellow one. She pressed it into his large, calloused palm. Then she did something that stunned everyone. She wrapped her tiny arms around his leg and hugged him as tight as she could. "Thank you," she whispered into the wet denim of his jeans. "Thank you for seeing me." Grizz placed a hand gently on her head, his vision blurring. In all his years, in all his battles, no victory had ever felt so profound. 1 year later, the roar of 100 Harley-Davidsons filled the air. They were lined up in the parking lot of the Corner Booth Diner, chrome glittering under a bright autumn sun. This was the first annual Lily's Ride, a charity event organized by the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club to raise money for the county's child abuse prevention network. Grizz sat on his bike at the head of the procession, a smile touching his lips. The event had been his idea, a way to turn a dark moment into a lasting beacon of hope. The entire community had embraced it. The diner itself had changed. A new sign hung over the door. The Corner Booth Diner, proud sponsor of Lily's ride. Inside, Mr. Thompson, now just Charles to his friends, bustled about, personally serving free coffee and donuts to all the bikers. He had become one of the charity's most ardent fundraisers. On the wall behind the counter, where the daily specials used to be, there was now a large framed photograph. It showed a giant, smiling biker with a little girl perched happily on his shoulders. A small hand tugged on Grizz's sleeve. He looked down into the bright, happy face of Lily. She was no longer a pale, frightened ghost. Her cheeks were rosy, her hair was tied in a cheerful ponytail, and her eyes, once stormy, were now as clear and blue as the autumn sky. She was thriving, safe and loved with her mother. "I made you something, Uncle Grizz," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a new drawing. This one depicted a little house with a garden, a smiling woman, and a smiling little girl holding hands. Standing beside them, larger than life, was a big man with a beard, wearing a leather vest with an eagle on the back. He was drawn with a crayon sunbeam shining down on him, like a guardian angel. Grizz's heart swelled. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his vest, next to all the others she had sent him over the past year. He looked at the little girl, at the assembled brotherhood of riders, at the humbled diner manager, and at the community that had come together. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles are not fought on foreign soil, but in the parking lot of a small-town diner. And that true strength was not in the noise you make or the fear you inspire, but in the quiet willingness to see someone who feels invisible and to promise them, with a simple nod, that you will not let them go.